was actually hoping the mic wouldn't work. So. Damn it. Thanks for letting me speak today. I know this is your last one, and then lunch, and then you guys wrap up. So, but I hope and think this will be an interesting last lecture. We'll spend about an hour. I wanted to talk about complex humanitarian emergencies, a little about what they are, and sort of highlight how the United States government and the humanitarian community in general respond to these emergencies. My work with the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, that's sort of the work I do, so that's the closest, obviously, to my heart. So we'll talk a little bit about it from that perspective, obviously. That's not the only perspective, but that's the one that I'm most familiar with. And then we'll move on to talk about the current Syrian conflict as sort of an example or model of how this all is operationalized. And I think it'll only take about 35 or 40 minutes for the actual talk, and then I'd love to hear. Usually there's quite a bit of discussion after this talk, and some good points are brought up and people's own experience. So I hope we have time for that. With that said, I'd like to start this with a quote from the International Committee on the Red Cross. And here in the United States, and really anywhere in the, either you call it the first world or the resource-rich world, we really don't have a lot of experience with disasters. I mean, in this country, we really can think of about Katrina, and that's about it in our lifetime, a true complex humanitarian emergency where there's either a natural disaster or a man-made disaster and a large displacement of people. We had a mudslide out here several months ago, but while that is a disaster, sort of a small d disaster, that really doesn't meet criteria for this kind of thing because there was not a big displacement of people. I mean, it was horrible, many lives were lost. But in terms of complex humanitarian emergencies, really Katrina is about the only thing you could think of in recent memory. But that's certainly not true worldwide, and that's why I think this quote is important. And the quote is, "Disasters are all too often regarded as unusual events, not parts of normal life. In reality, however, the opposite is true. Disasters and emergencies are a fundamental part of normal life. They are consequences of the way societies structure themselves economically and socially, the ways that societies and states interact, and the ways the relationships between decision makers are sustained." And if you look at the last 10 years, this really bears fruit. There have been about 298 major earthquakes. So this isn't there was an earthquake in the Aleutians off Alaska. This is an earthquake with humanitarian consequences. Destruction of people's residences, displacement of large numbers of people. This picture is Haiti after the 2010 earthquake when we were there. There were about 272 droughts, almost 1,700 floods. So floods, when you look at the United States government and even the worldwide response to disasters, floods are the most common thing we respond to. And there have been 52 wars. Unfortunately, a lot of the things, including the Syrian conflict, a lot of the things that we respond to are man-made. And as I said, I work for the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. So the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance is part of the United States Agency for International Development. And USAID is a separate government agency, just like Department of Defense or State Department. It's its own independent agency. The head, Raj Shah, who's actually from the Gates Foundation originally, is a presidential appointee. And part of that is the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. And the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance is the lead office to coordinate the US government response to international disasters. And their mandate is to save lives, alleviate suffering, and reduce the social and economic impact of disasters. Just to give you a little bit, I won't spend too much on organograms, but the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance falls under what's called DACA, which is the Bureau of Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance, and we sit right there with the red arrow. Within that, there is something called PSPM or TAG, the Technical Assistance Group. So much like something like the Gates Foundation or any foundation, OFDA is essentially a funding mechanism. We fund our implementing partners to work in the field, and those implementing partners, given that we work in disasters, are things like International Medical Corps or Save the Children, big NGOs that you see on the ground responding to disasters. So a lot of the folks that work at OFDA are grants people, there's a lot of lawyers running around, there's a lot of people in fancy suits. Because a lot of what we do is move US government money to partners, and it needs to be done relatively quickly, the nature of disasters. You can't wait 6 months for your government grant to get processed. So it's a fairly streamlined, it's a surprisingly streamlined, efficient system. But within that, you do need some technical people. You need people to say, hey, that thing you're funding is not technically sound or is technically sound. And someone to work with a partner to say, hey, this is not the best way to do this, can you do this a different way? And that's where the technical assistance group comes in. And I'm actually specifically in the health team. There's also a water sanitation and hygiene person. There are geophysical people that know about earthquakes, and I think you had a talk on that the other day. So there's a bunch of different technical groups, and I'm in the health team. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C., and interestingly, this is where the U.S. agency, the USAID is headquartered. This is the Ronald Reagan building, which is on 1300 Pennsylvania Avenue. And the irony here is that Ronald Reagan, who was, of course, the champion of small government, this is the single largest office building in the District of Columbia. The Pentagon doesn't count because it's not in the district, but this is literally the single largest. And then I think to add insult to injury, you've seen my politics here, but it's USAID and the Environmental Protection Agency. Now the downside of that is if you walk to the right, it's the Border Patrol, so there's lots of people in pants with pockets and guns, so Reagan would be okay. But anyway, this is where we're headquartered. It's right across from the White House. I was full-time there until just about a year and a half ago, I guess. We also have regional offices. Obviously, you need people in the field to respond immediately to disasters, and we've got them in Costa Rica, Senegal. There's one in South Africa. There's one in Bangkok. So we've got regional offices, and those are essentially human resources. There's no commodities there, but those are offices where our regional advisors can work with the partners directly. We have DoD, so the Department of Defense, obviously when a disaster strikes, the military has a big role. And there's always been a little friction with how the military responds and how the humanitarian community responds. They're not, someone who works for Doctors Without Borders and someone who is a member of the US Marines probably, in a lot of ways, don't have a lot in common. So we have liaisons in these offices to just sort of help make sure that the DoD is on the same page. The Department of Defense, in their defense, no pun intended, has gotten much better about how they respond to humanitarian. They realize that just driving a truck through a town and throwing MREs up the back of a truck is not a good way to deliver aid. And I think it's a good collegial relationship now because the DoD obviously has capabilities that no one else in the world does. If you need stuff lifted and flown somewhere, you need security, things like that. DoD actually does a great job. So there's a real effort to kind of get the civilian-military collaboration going. So some unlucky soul from my office has to sit in Hawaii. So anyway, so we've got those. And then we've also got warehouses, because we need to be able to mobilize commodities quickly. And what do I mean by commodities? Think of, what do you see in disasters? You see people living under plastic sheeting. You see people with bags of rice or flour. You see white Land Rovers with the USAID sticker. So you need a lot of these things. If there were a disaster, you don't have time to fly everything from the United States. So, oops, didn't mean to do that. So we've got 3 warehouses. One is in Pisa, Italy. One is down in Miami, and one is in Dubai. And those are just positioned so they have better reach. So for the US government to respond, of course, this is the US government, politics are involved. So you need these 3 things. The disaster has to be beyond the ability of the affected country to respond. So Japan, the tsunami in Japan is a great example. Japan is obviously very capable of responding, but they did ask for assistance from the Department of Energy because of the potential for nuclear exposure, or for radiation exposure. A country like Haiti had very little ability to respond, so they needed a lot of help. So you can you hope that the country will pick and choose what kind of assistance they want. But for us to help them, there has to be a formal disaster declaration and a request for US assistance. The country, of course, has to want or be willing to accept that assistance. And then the third one is the one that I think is a little sticky. It obviously has to be in the interest of the US government. And we all can see examples of where there seems to be something where the US government runs off and with full guns a-blazing respond, and then you see something that from a humanitarian standpoint looks just as horrible, and we've let it go for 20 years. And that's the politics. And I don't know what the right answer is. Clearly it's not gonna change anytime soon. So just to give you an example, in 2012, after responding to 63 disasters in 54 countries, at a cost of about $785 million. And remember we said the most common are floods, but the most funding is WASH. And WASH is water, sanitation, and hygiene. So getting people clean water and trying to prevent disease outbreaks. 2012 was sort of I think a typical year. Now in 2010, when the disaster hit in Haiti, that number was well over $1 billion. And this year, with the Syrian crisis, we're well over $1 billion every year. So. And then how does OFTA respond? What can they actually do? So starting at about 1 o'clock there, provide immediate assistance. There's a very formal process for the government to respond. The ambassador of a given country, so the ambassador to Haiti says, hey, I need help for this country that I'm the ambassador to. And there's a formal disaster declaration. And this is a very formal process with lots of people on conference calls in the State Department. And what this does is, part of it is it lets the ambassador write what we call a get well card. They can write a check for $50,000 or $100,000. So most of the responses to disasters are not land cruisers and plastic sheeting. It's the ambassador saying to their colleague in that country, be it the minister or the president, saying, hey, I know you've got some flooding in that region. Here's $100,000 from the U.S. government to help those people. So that's sort of the basic, and that's probably what happens most. There's no technical assistance there. That literally is a gift of financial resources. A lot of what we really do, I think, is we fund NGOs, international organizations, and UN organizations to provide assistance. So our implementing partners on the ground. NGOs like International Medical Corps, international organizations like IOM, UN organizations like the World Health Organization and UNICEF. We can also deploy a disaster assistance response team, or a DART. So if there were a disaster tomorrow there was an earthquake in Kathmandu, they would deploy a small team of 5 to 10 people to go out and do an assessment. What are the needs? What should we fund? Where should we focus? So for instance, when the typhoon went to the Philippines a couple of months ago, the team that went out said, we really need to prioritize shelter and water. Health was not a priority, partially because the Philippines had relatively good health infrastructure, and part of it is the epidemiology of that type of disaster. When you see a typhoon, there's not a lot of injuries. People are usually displaced, but things like typhoons and tsunamis, you're either okay or have minor injuries, or you're dead. Whereas an earthquake is very different. An earthquake, you've got lots of orthopedic injuries. So you have to prioritize. So in something like an earthquake, health and getting people there that can do medical work is a priority. In a typhoon, we just had a lot of people that don't have clean water, they don't have food, they have nowhere to live. So shelter, wash, and food were the priority. So the DART team will go out and do that. On the DC side, there's an RMT, we got about 7 o'clock. That's the response management team. So that's sort of the remote DART. So right now there's an office in Virginia where there's a Syria RMT. It's a bunch of people sitting in a room with computers and TVs, and they are working in shifts 24/7 to support what's going on in Syria. So it's like mission control, so to speak. Going up to 9 o'clock, you can dispatch commodities, those warehouses, plastic sheeting, food that doesn't need to be cooked, meals ready to eat, things like that. And then the top one is sort of where I get most involved, is providing technical assistance. And we can provide technical assistance both to our partners and to host countries. This is the DART. They go out in fancy little vests, and you get a cool hat and stuff like that. So, funding implementing partners, again, these are just some of the partners that we fund. Not a complete list by any means. And then technical assistance. This is Kathmandu in Nepal, it's the Kathmandu Valley is considered one of the most seismically active areas in the world. And I think when the Mexico City is up there, and Kathmandu are usually at the top of the list. When the big earthquake in 2010 hit Port-au-Prince, it was somewhat of a surprise. I think if you had asked most geologists where they thought it was going to be, this would have been their answer. And there's still great concern, and the big problem is you can see the buildings are not built well for a large earthquake. The way the ground is, it's a valley, and you can have liquefaction, so a major earthquake there would be an enormous disaster. And so we went out and worked with the Nepalese government to try to figure out how they should prioritize things. And from my standpoint, it was meeting with all the major hospitals. Do you guys have a disaster plan? It was meeting with local earthquake experts saying which hospitals are likely to still be standing and functioning if there's a major earthquake. Looking for open spaces. If you think about it, after an earthquake, open spaces are critical. Where are you going to put field hospitals? Where are people likely going to go when they are trying to escape their home? So it was a mapping of open spaces, trying to figure out where are going to be resources. Is the airport still going to be working? If the airport is closed, where are we going to fly in our resources? Can you count on the Chinese to let you do that? Do you need to go to India? So the technical assistance part is a little bit of disaster preparation, disaster risk reduction, things like that. This is one of the commodities that you can fly in. This is called the TSDU, which stands for Trauma Surgical Deployment Unit. It's basically a field hospital. It was started by my predecessor after Haiti. There was a feeling that the US government response to Haiti was less than ideal and very expensive. They sent DMAT teams and sort of federalized teams. And part of the problem was those teams are really designed to do domestic relief. They're not used to working in an international setting. And it's at great cost. Whereas if you fund this kind of thing, and you partner with a colleague like International Medical Corps, you're partnering with a colleague that has volunteers, so you don't need to pay them, and that has people that do this every day. This is what they do. So we partnered with International Medical Corps, we have a cooperative agreement, and we basically bought this hospital. This is actually Boise, Idaho. By coincidence, the company that makes these is in Boise, and it's amazing. This thing packs up into several big cases. You can see the background. And the idea being, if there were a disaster, let's say there were an earthquake in Kathmandu, we can mobilize this. We call them. They get the cases off the shelf. One of the things that OFDA can do that other private entities can is we can contract aircraft carriers very quickly. So they'll put a bid out to the industry and say, we need a 747 cargo plane to fly this to Kathmandu in 8 hours, and you get bids. And people bid, and you basically put this thing on a plane, fly it to wherever you need it, and International Medical Corps at the same time mobilizes their folks. And right now for this, they're using medical teams based at Stanford and at Harvard, just because they wanted US-based clinicians to staff this thing initially, and then sort of replace with local clinicians depending on the setting. And so this thing then gets flown and set up. So we were out there, we practiced setting it up. It's surprisingly easy to set up, it's surprisingly robust. And you should theoretically have this thing up and running in 24 hours. And this has got an operating room, it's got air conditioning, it's got oxygen concentrators, it's really a full-fledged, full-on trauma unit. Again, really designed for earthquakes. When the tsunami, or the typhoon hit in the Philippines, there was a lot of concern that there was going to be US government pressure from the Secretary of State and everything, let's get our fancy thing out there with our name on it. And it's really not appropriate. Where do you put this thing? When you've got people that are spread out all over the Philippines with relatively minor injuries, where do you put this thing to maximize it? Someone who's got a horrible injury is probably going to be too far away to get there in time. You think about the epicenter of an earthquake, you can draw circles around where you think the injuries are going to happen. So you have to think a little bit about the epidemiology of the disaster. So this is really designed for an earthquake response. Unfortunately, it did not go. It would have been a big waste of money. So with that background, let's talk a little bit about Syria, and then again, hopefully we'll have time for questions. So the country of Syria, for those that you don't know, it's got about 22 million people. The size is about 72,000 square miles. And whenever I even talk about a foreign country, I try to find a state that's about that size to give people perspective. And I was looking just to see. And this is just about the size of the state of Washington, within a couple hundred miles. I think the population of the state of Washington is about 6 or 7 million. Does anyone know? I think it's about 6 million. So this is a very densely populated country. The capital is Damascus, and the president is Bashar al-Assad. And it's sort of interesting. Well, it's a horrible story, but it's sort of an interesting one as well. Assad was the younger son of the former king of Syria, and really wanted nothing to do with politics. The older son was the heir apparent, and he was going to take over and was in the military. And Assad is actually an ophthalmologist, and trained in Damascus, and then went to London to do a fellowship, a pretty prestigious fellowship in ophthalmology, where he met his wife, who was from Britain, but Syrian, but who had worked for a bank, a big British bank. And if you've seen pictures of her in those days, it looks like somebody got really short hair. And they were this pretty yuppie couple in London. He was an ophthalmologist, she's working for a big bank. And the older brother was killed in a car accident. And the father said, hey, you gotta get back and take over. and he had no interest in politics. And he came back, and they had to kind of usher him through the military to give him clout. You know, he went through, became a general, whatever it is, very quickly, and then subsequently took over the country. And I just think it's an interesting transition to see where he was then, where he is now, and you know, you think about what power does to people, and now looking back, I mean, well, we'll see, because it looks like he may ultimately win this conflict. But you know, if he had called for democratic elections, and you know, he could have really looked like a hero and gone back to London with his millions. But it's just sort of I think it's an interesting dynamic, the choices he's made, where he is now, and a guy who's as a physician, some of the things he's been accused of doing. I think it's an interesting story. So healthcare in Syria is free. Like most countries that have free healthcare, funding limits quality. They are running into some of the same problems that you expect. Anyway, they don't have the tax base that the Scandinavians have, so their health system, all free, is not a fantastic one. About 75% or 77% of the beds are public, and about 23% are private. It's pretty decentralized to village, district, and provincial level, and as you can imagine, there's significant regional disparities. If you're wealthy and you live in Damascus, you can probably get US quality healthcare. You can get chemotherapy, you can get dialysis, whatever you want. If you're a poor person living in a rural area, you're going to get pretty crappy healthcare. So again, facing a lot of the same disparities and financial constraints that you're seeing all over the world. This is a little video. This is, remember, Arab Spring in 2011 was spreading through the Middle East, and Syria is no exception. This is a little bit of how Arab Spring occurred, or tried to occur, in Syria. I think the number killed now is probably closer to 150,000. So in 2011, there was an uprising with Arab Spring. The government cracked down. There's been a war going on ever since. And people fled to the surrounding countries. I don't have a point to, but in Syria, there's about 10 million people that are in need of humanitarian assistance. Don't have water, don't have health care, don't have food, whatever they need, are being persecuted or threatened. About 6.5 million are actually internally displaced, so they're no longer living in their homes, but they're living within Syria. If you look at the people that have left the country, i.e. refugees, they're going primarily to Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. And those numbers are probably about 4 months old, but you get the idea. It's well over a couple million people that have been displaced. Right now in Jordan, I think that 1 in 6 people in Jordan is Syrian now from the refugee influx, which has implications for the Jordanians, and obviously. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees is the UN organization that's responsible for refugees. And Antonio Guterres was the High Commissioner in 2013, and he said, "We've not seen a refugee outflow escalate to such frightening rates since the Rwandan genocide 20 years ago." For those of you, it's like for a lot of us, we remember when the refugees from Rwanda went over into Zaire, into the fields, and this has sort of been, again, this is as bad as that 20 years later. Obviously, these things have a major toll in terms of humanitarian consequences. They're also very expensive. And not surprisingly, the US government has led the way in terms of spending. This is also needs to be updated. This is for 2011 and 12, that we're well over $1.3 billion we've spent on this. And I think that has ethical implications for what we do in this country. And again, in my role at OFTA, that's not my job, that's not responsibility, but I think to the American public saying, why are we spending $1.3 billion a year to support efforts in Syria? So, and again, it's not about coming to a right answer. It's an interesting, I think it's an interesting discussion. The rest of the world has actually been pretty good. The Europeans and the UK and a lot of the Middle Eastern countries since this time. The Saudis have actually given quite a bit of money. Kuwait, countries like that. So now, where I sort of come in, or where OFTA comes in, is now how do you support a health system given that background? So there's complete collapse of the health system, as you can imagine. Little pockets in Damascus, which is controlled by the Assad government. I think there's probably private clinics that are still working, but for the average, relatively poor Syrian citizen, there's no health system. And how do you support that, and how do you prioritize that? And how do you deliver health care, and where do you deliver health care? And for the US government, a lot of it is supporting, we're not sending US citizens into Syria. That's not something that happens politically. So, we can't send a US-based medical team into Syria. So we're supporting partners across border, and a lot of them, because of the anti-government sentiment, are not operating under their traditional names. So a well-known NGO that may be a US-based NGO or a US office now has a different, now they're the Syrian refugee something organization. So it's a little bit tricky. Things like an earthquake, everybody's, I don't mean to sound glib, but after an earthquake, everybody's in a good mood, everybody wants to help, and everybody's on the same team and goes out of the way to help. This is not the case here. There's a side that, if someone is injured in battle, the person who shot them doesn't want you to go in and fix them up so they can get back out there and shoot them again. And obviously, this kid's an innocent victim, but again, it's different when you're in a conflict. Just to sort of tighten up some language, this is something that that a lot of people sort of confuse or don't realize is important. So the kids on the left those are kids in Haiti. This was after the earthquake. Not that it matters, but this was a school in the IDP camp that Sean Penn was running. So these kids are still living in their country. So they're internally displaced. They're IDPs. And so they are the responsibility of USAID and OFDA. So we are responsible for people that are within their country. So we are funding programs to help the Syrians still within Syria. These kids are Angolan living in a Zambian refugee camp. So their parents and grandparents escaped the problems in Angola 3 generations ago, and they're still living there. So these kids are refugees. They've crossed an international border. And that has very specific implications legally. So they're the responsibility of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And UNHCR is a protection organization. They're not a health organization. The people that are the head of an office for UNHCR are lawyers. They're not doctors, they're not nurses. UNHCR views themselves as there to protect refugees. IDPs get no such protection. Now UNHCR is starting to mission creep a little bit to help IDPs, but it's tricky because they don't have any real authority in a sovereign country. So, and from the US government side, refugees come under the State Department. And you can sort of understand that because refugees may want to come to the United States, and there's something called PRM, which is Populations, Refugees, and Migration, which is part of State Department, and they're in charge of programming for refugees. The problem becomes when you're trying to do health programming. As you can imagine, the health needs for these kids is very similar. So now you've got two big government agencies that are in charge of health programming that don't always talk to each other, and maybe funding overlapping programs, maybe funding the same partner to do things, may have different philosophies on what's appropriate. I will tell you that the State Department does much less of a technical review of their proposals than USAID does. So it's a little bit of a problem, and it's where the politics drives the divide, and healthcare really doesn't. Healthcare doesn't see that divide. The divide doesn't fall out in healthcare. So it's a little bit tricky. Our colleagues at State are great, and we talk to them frequently. So in that, delivering healthcare to refugees is relatively more straightforward. Refugees are in camps or settlements. This is a camp in Jordan. And so you've got everyone at least in one area. They're not in the midst of the fighting. They're relatively safe. It's a crappy place to live. Don't get me wrong. Growing up in a refugee camp would be, is nowhere for anyone to grow up. But at least they're not in the fighting. They're provided free healthcare. In some refugee camps, there's a healthcare facility within the camp. In some, you get vouchers to go use the Jordanian healthcare system. So these guys can go use the Jordanian hospital down the street. It's always helpful if culturally the countries are similar. If you're if the Jordanian healthcare system and the Syrian healthcare system are similar in terms of gender of provider and things like that, it makes it a lot easier than if you've got discrepancies there. If refugees feel persecuted, I don't want to go to that Jordanian hospital because they'll treat me poorly. But again, the healthcare delivery for refugees is relatively straightforward. The healthcare delivery for IDPs is a lot more complicated because you can't access them directly. They're constantly moving. They're constantly under the threat of violence. And as you can imagine, there's sort of been an ebb and flow of what's been most needed. Initially, and even today, trauma continues to be a big problem. When you're living in a war zone, traumatic injuries do a cure. So you need to have a good trauma system, and that's difficult to deliver across the border. Initially, primary care wasn't such a big deal because the healthcare system in Syria was fairly robust, and so when it collapsed, people kind of had enough reserve that they were doing okay. If UW Hospital closed tomorrow and said we're going to close for a year, most of us would be okay for 6 months or something, assuming we didn't need dialysis or we didn't need, we could get medications. But in general, these are folks that had immunizations, that were relatively healthy. But as the conflict has gone on and there is no primary, then you start to see problems with primary health care. Well, I've run out of my medication. Now you've got a generation of kids who are not immunized against polio and measles and things like that. So. Reproductive health is a huge issue. As an example, cesarean section rates are sky high. And part of it is that the rates in Syria are very high anyway. There's probably about a 30% C-section rate in Syria for whatever reason. They don't do VBAC, so everyone, if you had a C-section, you get another C-section. But that's even increased more because if you're a pregnant woman in Syria and you're living in a war zone, you're going to say, hey, I'm scheduling my C-section, and if the hospital happens to get blown up that morning, I'm just not showing up. But the fear is, what if I go into labor in the middle of the night, and there's a firefight, and I can't get there, or the hospital's blown up? So now the C-section rates have skyrocketed at 50–60%, and it's a huge issue. Chronic disease. Syria, I think, has taught or is teaching the humanitarian community a lot of lessons about where this is going. In somewhere like Haiti, which I keep using, but it's a great recent example, or in an African conflict, we could probably all sit down and agree, okay, let's see, what are we going to prioritize? Everyone agree that bed nets to prevent malaria is a good idea? Yeah, relatively cheap, safe, good intervention. Antibiotics, kids get pneumonia, sure. Safe water to prevent diarrhea, treatment of diarrhea, yeah, that's all kind of low-hanging fruit. But now what do you do in a country where someone says, I need a dialysis machine for $100,000 for my 8 patients? Do you fund that? And you can see this is a slippery slope. Chemotherapy. So countries that have a burden of chronic disease, which they don't in a lot of African countries, because they're so poor, people don't get old enough to have the burden of chronic disease, although that is changing. But in general, now you've got a population with a lot of chronic, heart disease, diabetes, renal disease, it sort of changes the playing field. Where do you set your parameters? And this is a huge issue, both for the donors like the FDA, and also for the humanitarian community in general. We're just not prepared. The inputting partners, MSF, we don't know what to do with this, what are we prepared against? And I think it's going to continue to be an enormous problem. Mental health. Mental health is probably the single most underfunded, poorly understood, and poorly managed part of this company. I mean, you can imagine mental health is tricky even in the best of circumstances. How do you do behavioral cognitive therapy, when someone's living in a war zone? And especially children, kids that have seen their parents killed, have seen their entire, school blown up, their entire lives are unimaginable to us. And how do you start to even repair that while it's still going on? And so I always tell, when I talk to global health students, that if you want to do research or you want to try to get something funded, try to do it in mental health, because it's such a need, and the gaps are just incredible. You need facilities. So how do you fund facilities? Again, a lot of when we talk to our partners, they will set up an operating room in the basement of an apartment building. And they'll say, yeah, we were good for about 2 months until it got blown up, and we packed everything up in the middle of the night and moved it. And then they say, oh, by the way, we need a new anesthesia machine because the other one got blown up. And you start getting these requests, and you're thinking, how legit are these? This is actually a hospital. This hospital is actually in Jordan. It's right over the border. So AFTA is funding, even though it's not in Syria. But when we were here, even in Syria, it was just over the hill. And when we visited the day, I think there were 60 patients, and about 55 of them were men between 18 and 30, all with extremity injuries from gunfire. And it sort of makes sense. If you get shot in the chest in the middle of Syria, you're not going to make it to get here. But you get shot in the arm, yeah, you might. And a lot of it was the physicians there, a lot of it was redoing surgeries that were poorly done in these makeshift hospitals within Syria. You need supplies and equipment. And again, in Haiti, everyone is in a good mood, everybody donates, everyone, the Haitian government sort of helps facilitate things through the port, at least initially. But in here, you have to kind of be careful. The border is very plus minus. One day the border guard says, no, you can't take your stuff, or what do you have there? Or, do you have a case of baby food? Because my kid needs it if you want your truck to go through. So this is actually the basement of, it was pretty funny, I thought, because this is a goofy stop spying movie. This is one of the countries around Syria, and it was this beautiful residential neighborhood, and we drove through this neighborhood and through a gate, and this is actually a basement of a nice, but just a residential house that one of the partners had rented, and they were using it as a warehouse for materials to get them over the border. And they were literally packing supplies into backpacks, because you can't just put it on an 18-wheeler and hope to drive into Damascus to set up your field hospital. They had these burlap sacks, and they were putting stuff in these burlap sacks, and people are literally carrying the stuff across the border. And again, when you talk to these guys about their experience, they said a lot of it's predictable. I mean, if you're going through surgical supplies, the view of the Syrian army is, well, you're just going to patch up someone who just shot at you the other day. Forget it. If you go through with vaccines for kids, they're like, yeah, that's a good thing. So there is some amount of humanitarianism within that, I think. But it's tricky. Infectious disease. So with this deterioration of the healthcare system, and deterioration of the water system, and lack of maintenance of sewage processing, you start to see infectious disease. In places like Haiti, the cholera outbreak, that also happened relatively quickly. In Syria, it's taken longer because, again, they had that reserve. And this is one of the big fears, is even in Syria, is there going to be a cholera outbreak? And now, there's the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And how do you pick up these things? And this is one of the things that I'm sort of interested in. You need to do surveillance. You need to do disease surveillance. And it's tricky. In the United States, we don't even do great disease surveillance. I'm embarrassed to say, I probably don't know what diseases are reportable in the state of Washington. I work in the emergency department right over there. I don't remember the last time I reported something. Yeah, this is me. But you're just too busy. So, fortunately, I think this is all over it, so we can find some stay home. But in a war zone, it's incredibly complicated. And you need to do this to make sure, how do you pick up that first case of cholera to make sure that you don't get too far behind? And so what people use, or what's used, is called eWarn, which is the Early Warning Response Network, which is developed by the World Health Organization with the assistance of the Centers for Disease Control. And you have to incorporate your partners. Where are you going to pick up the diseases? The old adage is, why did you rob the bank? Well, that's where the money is. Well, where do you do disease surveillance? You got to be where the patients are. The best place to figure out if you've got a case of Ebola is at a hospital where that patient shows up with that fever and bleeding, and someone says, wow, you've got Ebola. So you have to you need your data collection sheet, and we've got the diseases that are applicable to the area, and then you need your case definitions, because you want everyone to be on the same page. You may see a case of malaria as a little kid with fever. You may say, well, it's a little kid with fever, and I want to see the malaria parasite on microscopy. So you need to make sure your case definitions are the same. And then you also have to define, so the case definitions, the diseases, you also have to define what's an outbreak. So if I see one case of cholera, that's an outbreak. That's raised the red flag. If you see one case of measles, one case of polio, fine. But what about one case of bloody diarrhea? Well, no, we actually need 5 cases of bloody diarrhea that are epidemiologically linked. And these are just sort of set so you don't miss things, but you don't overreact. So the trick is you need to figure out who's working in the area. You need to come and train them on this. You need to get them to actually fill out the form every week. You need to get them to get you the data somehow, either internet or cell phone or carrier pigeon. You need to then have someone be responsible for the data, get the results, and then do something with the results. And then if you do have an outbreak, how are you going to respond? Where's the lab capacity? Let's say we do think we have cholera in Syria. Are we going to find a lab in Syria that can identify it, or do we sneak it across the border into Turkey and have them do it? So there's a lot of challenges. This is the system that picked up, this is old because there's more than 70 cases, but this is the system that picked up the cases of polio. There's a polio outbreak in Syria right now. World Health Organization has actually immunized, I think, 2.2 million kids already, so I think the response is reasonably good, but this is just the kind of thing we worry about. And again, polio immunization. Anywhere except for maybe the United States and Europe, we use oral polio. In this country, we don't do that anymore. We use the injectable. So I think, just to wrap up and then have some questions, I think the challenge is, I think these are the big ones. I think disease surveillance, response, and immunizations, especially in Syria, is becoming a big problem because it is difficult to monitor. You can't just ask both sides to do a ceasefire so you can set up an immunization tent. So it's very tricky. Monitoring and evaluation of programs. Again, not being able to access them. How does the US government, how does Optum know that their money is being spent appropriately? It's tricky. We sort of have to take the partner's word for it. Well, you need another anesthesia machine. Is it really because yours was destroyed, or one of your Syrian colleagues needs one for their private hospital? Just, well, the US is paying for it, add it to the list. And how you monitor that, how you evaluate that. And then I think the final one, which is really a policy question, is the level of care. Where do we draw that bar? Because we're not just dealing with antibiotics, we're not just dealing with bed nets. And it's interesting because when my boss said, when we started discussing this during the early days of this time in Syria, he said, well, you're the health guy, just tell me, what do we support? And I said, that's a policy question, not a technical question. If you as the US government say, we want to support the healthcare in Syria to the level it was before the crisis, then I as a technical person will tell you what that means. Yes, they had this level of chemotherapy. Yes, they had this many dialysis machines per capita. Yes, they had these antibiotics. But to just say to someone, tell us what we should support, I said it ad nauseum. Finally they got it. I said, you're looking for a technical answer to a policy question. And they've since, I think, realized that, and we've now written a policy for our response that's been signed off by the head of OFDA. But it's very tricky. We don't know what to do. Do you buy the dialysis machine? I use that because I think that's a great example. I'm not against dialysis, but that $100,000 that's going to serve 10 patients, how many immunizations do we buy? And it's not any different than rationing of healthcare dollars in this country. Someone in the ICU spending $15,000 a day, they've got to come home. And again, I'm not trying to judge, I just think these are the issues that become very real when you're trying to figure out what we fund. So with that said, questions, comments? Got about 12 minutes, and you can get out early for lunch. Someone's got it.
Yes? You had shown a while back there on the Syria slide about how the country's broken down, the villages and everything. Do you take into consideration the culture itself? You know, you think there's some countries in which, I think back in the Balkans and such, where there's so much internal strife going on to begin with, and if what you approve of would work in one country with very little internal strife as opposed to Syria, how does that come up?
Right, and so the question, if I understand, is when you're trying to figure out what to support or what to fund, what considerations do you need to have for cultural differences or nuances of all the, and absolutely, every case is different, and I think that's one of the issues we've had with the Department of Defense, is you can't come in and just set up a US-style hospital in the middle of country X. And a lot of it, yeah, you do have to work within their system. You try to replicate the kind of system. And things in a country like Syria, the gender of provider, especially for women, is huge. You know, a woman is not going to go to see a male OBGYN in a Muslim country, largely, and there's exceptions. But so no, you're absolutely right. And where people deliver, are they used to delivering with you know, a traditional birth attendant versus a skilled birth attendant versus in a facility and what you support. And so it's a combination of trying to replicate that, being culturally appropriate, but also knowing that you're providing high quality care. Like traditional birth attendants is a great, the US government does not support traditional birth attendants in labor and delivery. They can in other sort of peri-delivery education and things like that, but as a policy, they do not do that because they feel that is risky. And if you look at the data, women that don't deliver with skilled birth attendants have incredibly high mortality rates. So some of it is a balance between what's culturally appropriate and what's not. And, you know, one of the problems with the response to Haiti was, for better or for worse, Haiti is 600 miles off of Florida, which meant that every person who felt good about it, you know, got together with their friends, they bought matching t-shirts, and they went down to Haiti with boxes of antibiotics. And the problem is that, you know, there were a lot of very complicated orthopedic surgeries. You know, US orthopedists that said, wow, I can fix this kid's leg. And they went back in the year and the kid still had the external fixator on because there's no follow-up. And the Haitian system that remains is completely incapable of helping them. Now, do you cut the kid's leg off as an alternative? I don't know, but you do. You have to be very careful that what you're doing is sustainable, is culturally appropriate, but it's also good health care. And that sort of, if you drew those three diagrams, the part that overlaps is, you know, in some countries it's relatively small, but you're absolutely right. Yeah.
This is not a very well formulated question.
I'll give you a not formulated answer.
I think there was, I was looking at something, I think there's a UN report that talks about the lack of sustainability over time of the Palestinian people, that environment with issues about water, salt water, and just all sorts of infrastructure issues. And now that the conflict has come up again, what are your concerns with that kind of different situation where you have something that's internal that involves a developed country and a less developed country, and the idea that the land itself might not be able to sustain the population?
Yeah, so the question is, how do you respond to when you've got a situation where just the inherent qualities of that country cannot sustain that population? And the example is, you know, potable water in the Middle East and having to desalinate. And I don't know. I mean, it's very tricky, and that's why you know, Ofta's got a lot of agricultural folks, because again, you know, Africa is a great example. You know, as the population grows and as people are living longer, which is a good thing, but is the land can sustain to give water and food? And so my colleagues on the agriculture side spend a lot of time with local farmers. How can you get more out of your land? How do you keep your livestock healthy? It's a big problem. You know, the Israeli-Palestinian thing is clearly an incredible mess, and you know, we've got, once again, it's flared up with the murder of the 4 teenagers here on one side and on the other. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the U.S. government is sort of, obviously, you know, you guys know foreign policy. I mean, obviously Israel is a close ally for a lot of very good reasons. And, you know, whether it's going to be a two-state solution, I don't know. But it's a big, you know, it's a big problem. And controlling water there is very political. And you know, I think the Palestinians are. It's tricky. I mean, it's hard. I mean, on one side, you know, I think the for the average Palestinian, it is a horrible existence. But, you know, for the, you know, some of the response by either side is understandable. I think without getting too much into politics, but, you know, I was thinking in this country the equivalent would be, and this may piss people off, but the equivalent would be, you know, Native Americans are like the Palestinians. We've taken, you know, Native Americans, we've made them live in their country in small areas, and you think, okay, if Native Americans rose up and walked into Walmart and blew themselves up, yeah, the U.S. government would respond. They'd roll tanks into the, and so it's tricky. I mean, both sides are sort of screwed, and unfortunately, the history is such that I think it's debatable whether they really want to work together or not. I mean, I think the average Israeli and the average Palestinian certainly do, but you know, I don't know. It's a mess.
Do you think you'll be able to go in and help people as an organization if it comes to a medical?
In Syria or in?
In the Palestinian situation.
Yeah, I don't think that's as, yeah, I think, you know, I think humanitarian assistance gets a little bit of political, you know, it's okay. You know, for instance, you know, I think if we really view that someone is being, that innocent people are being victimized, again, it has to be in the interest of the U.S., whatever that means. But even if, you know, I think if there were a real problem in Palestine, in where the Palestinians live, I should say, and we needed to go in, I think that would be a lot. But I'm not a policymaker. But you know, and I think in Syria they will go in once there's some resolution to come. You know, if the opposition takes over, whatever that means, I think that the U.S. government is prepared to go in and help clean up. If the Assad government wins, then, you know, I think we're sort of still working across borders. So, and again, that's the political side, and I really have nothing. It's fascinating, having been in D.C. now, it's fascinating to watch that and watch that process as someone who is a public health person and a clinician, see how, you know, you give them a document and it gets touched by 10 people who are more political than technical, and it comes back to you unrecognizable. But I certainly don't claim that means it. Yeah.
I thought the photographs that you had in the presentation were amazing, very emotionally provoking, and I was wondering, is that part of your organization that photographs those events and those places as they're involved with it, or where did you get that?
So the question is the photographs, and it's a little bit of a mix. Some of them are U.S. government, some of them are mine, and some of them are brought to you by Google image search. And that's part of why this one I think is off one of the UN websites. There's actually quite a few good websites. You know, the ones in Syria, I did not go to Syria when I was there because I'm a U.S. government employee, so those are also borrowed and helpers. But you know, in general, I think a picture really does. I think death by PowerPoint is probably the 4th largest killer in the United States. So I try to do a lot of pictures. And no, I think it's provoking because these are real people who, you know, it just amazes me that, and again, I'm a little bit of a cynic, I will agree, but, you know, you'll see something where someone in this country, you know, some child dies or is killed or something, and that is a horrible, horrible event, don't get me wrong. But I think, you know, in the time that this 30-minute newscast that featured that kid occurred, you know, 30 kids in Africa died from malaria, and no one cares. I mean, it's not that no one cares, but, and so, and some of it is nationalism, and some of it, well, that person's like us, and some of it is the way the news delivers it, but it's a little perverse, and I think that showing pictures that these are real people, I hope, helps bring the message across better. So.
You talked a lot, it was very helpful, about what the healthcare infrastructure is in Syria, and also a little bit about the other kinds of infrastructure. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you go about gathering that information, especially when suddenly you find that you need more than you already have because there's an emergent situation.
Very tricky, and this is sort of where you know, data and access to data, and it really depends on what's there. A lot of times you have to, again, in a situation like Haiti where you're welcome. I was in Haiti helping set up malaria surveillance after the earthquake. There was a concern that now people are displaced and no longer living indoors. They're exposed to mosquitoes, and there is malaria in Haiti. It's falciparum, which is the bad malaria. And there was real concern that there was going to be a malaria outbreak. Now the cholera outbreak sort of took over, and that was not an issue. But so we were trying to set up surveillance. So I was meeting with the Ministry of Health and Population and saying, do you guys have data? And they would give us data. And you could tell that no one had really vetted it. It was, you sort of look at it at night, and I'd come in with questions the next morning about why these numbers don't match up, and it was very clear that Syria is probably a little better. Data for immunization rates in Syria was pretty good. But some of it is, the Ministry of Health working with WHO, and the WHO part, sort of third-hand information because of the politics. But yeah, gathering information is critical. And WHO has thought about trying to get this ahead of time, trying to figure out which countries are likely to have disasters and having sort of fact sheets on them. And I sort of have mixed feelings because it costs a lot of money and they do this and then no one ever goes back, and if it's the wrong country or it's now 10 years old, how do you keep that information updated? It's hard, and you sort of have to just scramble whatever you can. Data is usually incomplete and usually not completely accurate. So, yeah.
When you're talking about disease surveillance and reportable diseases, is that dependent only on the formal healthcare system in an area where very few people get access to that formal healthcare system? Or is there a way to set up some kind of social network or social media that might detect things sooner?
Right. That's sort of a hot topic, the use of social media and how, and I have mixed feelings about that. Both in its accuracy. There's a lot of everything from really trying to engage community leaders on the ground and say text this number if you see this kind of disease, to looking at Google searches for influenza and deciding, given that Google searches regionally, how much influenza there is there. So I think it's a mixed bag. I think it's a double-edged sword. I think there's the potential to get information, but there's such a potential to get misinformation. People are kind of all over the spectrum on this. I tend to not be a big fan of that, but I'm probably in the minority, and I'm very much looking forward to be proven wrong. But I think right now, a lot of the Facebook and texting stuff, and people can track population movements pretty well with cell phones in countries where most people have cell phones, and they did that a little bit in Haiti, where you could kind of track where people went. But in terms of disease outbreak, it's tricky. We do use cell phones to report. So if you train a provider, hey, this is our definition of malaria. If you see a case, text us, or every week. We have in Africa, they're in stable countries, but there's a lot of surveillance where the community health worker has a phone, and he or she every week texts in on a menu how many cases of X, Y, and Z you had. So I do think I think that when everyone's on the same page and the training is appropriate, I think it's very useful. I think sort of ad hoc, public, well, we're going to try to gather this information is trickier. But there's a lot of people who disagree and think it's very valuable. I think the jury's still out. Should we stop? We should stop. You guys need lunch. Thanks.